So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about subcontractors and a few items that we see with our customers where they have some challenges that OpenAir can assist with. We'll talk about some of the options around resource and talent profiles. We'll talk about time and monitoring and documenting and managing contractor time. What types of information do we see shared with contractors? And what types of reports do our customers run to monitor their contractors? So those are a few of the highlights that we'll be covering today. But what is subcontractor management, right? I'm sure most of you as a professional service organizations use external resources to help deliver your team. Some of the struggles we see with some of our customers are, they could have different costs based on the type of work they're doing or the type of project they're working on. And also, being able to track, what is their skill set and being able to do some searching on those skills and be able to include both your internal and your contractor skills. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Understanding availability is always a challenge with contractors because you don't necessarily control their calendar. Being able to manage their user accounts if you are allowing your contractors to log into OpenAir and enter their time, being able to manage those contractor licensing. And then also being able to limit the system, right? Generally, we don't want contractors to see a large amount of data inside of OpenAir. We want to limit that visibility. So we'll talk a little bit about that and some of the things we've seen. So there's two approaches that we work with customers on being able to grant access to OpenAir from a user subcontractor level. If you have, if you're not using a lot of subcontractors, or if you're using a lot of independents, a lot of 1099s, generally we see they're set up just like an employee. They have a user account in OpenAir and they're allowed to log directly into OpenAir. And so that's pretty common. It does cost additional licenses, but these people are generally working on projects and billing the same way your employees are. We've also seen where if you're using subcontractors that are provided by a larger vendor, say, vendor A is giving you, 10 resources that you're using. You don't want to set up all 10 resources as individuals on your in your user account. You may set up general vendor A as its own user and then have them log in and enter time on behalf of their subcontractors and use the notes and description fields to identify which resources are doing the work. The benefit here is it does give you less user count towards your OpenAir licensing. But the downside is you have some limited visibility as to who's on which project and doing the work around, task assignments and resourcing, et cetera. So you have to weigh the pros and the cons of being able to, choose whether you want to have a general account or a user account. Now you could have both. You could use both approaches if you have some individuals that need access, obviously, and if you have some vendor accounts that you want to set up. So it's just certainly understanding of your model and how you treat your vendors and the type of reporting you're looking to get out of OpenAir. So let's go down the path of setting up a user account as a contractor, right? We want to make sure that we can identify those and pull those out for reporting purposes. At a minimum, you should definitely track that as a user type on the user record with a custom field. Being able to, if you're running a utilization report, you may want to exclude your contractors. And so you want to be able to have the ability to do that. What we generally, though, recommend is the use of entity tags inside of OpenAir. So the benefit of the entity tag is allows you to have almost a start and end date with regards to a status or a record. So it's a custom field that allows you to start and end date. So you could have an employment status where you have employee, contractor, or not employed, and be able to use that tag to be able to move people. So if someone's an employee between certain dates and then moves to a contractor, You don't have to create a new record. You can update your user tags. Then when you run reports, you'll be able to see, for a certain period of time they were an employee, and other periods of time they were a contractor. And then you can exclude, for the period they were a contractor, you can then include or exclude that your user from certain reports. So it's a great way to be able to track if people change statuses, or if as contractors come and go inside of your organization. And this is the basic. It can be used on any account users, but for entity tags, those are only available on an individual user account, as they're not available on generic resources. So the one thing customers always are worried about is when my contractor logs in, what are they going to see, or what are they going to be able to do, right? So that's always a large conversation around roles and permissions. So we certainly, if your contractors need to have very limited access into OpenAir, then certainly, we want to have a role. And generally that role is the lowest permission role inside of OpenAir that basically allows them very little they can do other than, entering time and potentially entering expenses. And then you would allow them to only see data that is assigned to them or booked to them, depending on how your OpenAir system is set. So their filter set would also be extremely limited. They wouldn't be able to see anyone else's time, obviously, or expenses, unless that's something you'd want them to do. So make sure that, that's something taken into consideration. You can also limit their access to create or edit reports. So you may want to have reports shared with contractor, and we'll talk about some of the ones we see that are common, but you may not want them to be able to create or edit reports. And that's also something in the role that you'll be able to set up. One thing to be careful of is when you create a user in OpenAir, there's this ability to automatically add new users to the assignment group. And so if you have an all-employee assignment group, you don't want to add your contractor to that assignment group by mistake, because then they will inherit all of the internal projects and time off projects you might have, as well as some of the other projects that you don't want contractors. So when you're creating that new contractor, if you're using that automatically add for a particular assignment group, you'll want to make sure that you remove the assignment group from that subcontractor as part of your subcontractor user setup. So we're seeing more and more customers embracing skill profiles in OpenAir, and especially for subcontractors, there's a lot of value that can be derived from that. You can have subcontractors can come and go, and so the subcontractor may do some work and they may go away, and during that time their user account's been inactivated because you don't want to pay a license if they're no longer working. But you still want to be able to say, who can do this work, and who have we worked with in the past, or what contractors have we worked with in the past that have this particular skill set. So with some of the newer advanced research searches that have come out, it allows you to be able to search for certain skills and experience based on what's important to you on your projects, but also be able to search for inactive resources, which is a great way to be able to say who's done work before for a particular customer, or who's got a certain skill set that's no longer with the company. As well as in the latest release, they've added a new search parameter. If you don't see it, it should have been auto-enabled in everyone's account, and it allows you to search by hourly cost. So if you're looking for a particular contractor or type of contractor, and you want to say, I'm looking for someone that's in the X range, X low to X high range, searching by hourly cost is now another parameter which resource profiles can be used. Also, we talked earlier about entity tags, and entity tags can also be used in an advanced resource search. So if you're using that employment status type of entity tag, and you want to search particularly for contractors or not contractors, or contractors as of a certain date, you can use entity tags, and you can use a effective date to be able to go ahead and do that search, and it help you refine your search parameters much more. So let's talk about cost management. So, you know, project profitability is a very, you know, important metric that, you know, those of you with OpenAir obviously are able to report on, as long as you're tracking your costs in OpenAir and then you're billing or revenue recognition. How do we manage subcontractor costs? And here's some of the different ways we've seen that. You could actually just have a contractor's costs show up in an expense report. So we've seen customers that'll say, we're going to create a subcontractor expense item. We get a contractor invoice, and we'll create an expense report that will add the cost of that invoice for a particular contractor or group of contractors down to a project. So this basically allows you to add the cost in OpenAir and be able to report on that cost as part of your project profitability, but you're not paying for licenses in this case for the users. So this is one way we've seen where customers have used added costs to their projects. Another way we see is where customers will fixed fee the work to their contractors. So it's not based on the time they enter, it's based on the fixed fee amount to which they agree to do a particular scope of work. So when that scenario happens, what we see a lot is there's an OpenAir, there's a purchasing module, and you can actually go in and create a vendor PO for that defined scope of work and the dollars agreed upon. And then as you get the contractor invoices, you can actually fulfill those vendor POs over either in a single fulfillment or multiple fulfillments. And as you're fulfilling those POs, then those costs show up and are now reportable against your project. So if you're using NetSuite as your ERP, you know, you can actually take vendor bills from NetSuite and integrate them into the OpenAir purchasing module to create those vendor POs directly from the feed from NetSuite. So rather than doing it manually in OpenAir. So the purchasing module was really designed to add cost to projects where it's not time-based or based on an expense report. So it's any third-party cost could be entered there and managed in there as well. The most common process we see is where subcontractors are entering time into OpenAir. They are part of the project team and they are treated as such for the most part. And so, you know, we'll talk a little bit more about this process and what we see as best practices, but by far this certainly is very common practice. And you don't have to use any of these. You know, you can use a combination of these. You may have some that you want to enter as POs or expense reports. You may have some that you want to go directly to timesheets. So you can really kind of mix and match depending on what your scenario is and how you want your costs to get into the OpenAir and to the project. So a couple of things around entering time directly, right? You want to make sure they only see projects that they are assigned or booked to. So obviously you want to make sure your filter sets are set. And again, you want to make sure they don't accidentally get put into assignment groups where they're seeing more than they should. So certainly that's pretty simple filter setting that you would do in OpenAir to make that happen. You also may or may not want them to receive late timesheets alerts. So depending on whether they're going to include those or not, you can use, you know, there's ways to exclude or include them from some of your standard timesheet alerts. And I'll show you in a minute what that looks like. And then lastly, and I think this is probably one of the coolest features in OpenAir for managing subcontractors, is the ability to reconcile time entries with vendor invoices. And so I'm going to actually jump into OpenAir when we get to this slide, and I think it's easier to demo than it is to talk to. So for those of you probably know, you have the ability to set up custom timesheet alerts and, schedule those to trigger based on the rules you put in. There's a couple of things that you could do to have those, let's say you wanted subcontractors not to receive those alerts. You could use a timesheet required checkbox on the user record and uncheck that and only send alerts to those timesheet required users. So that would then omit those alerts to the subcontractors. You could also, what I've seen common as well, is create a department using the standard department feature for subcontractors, and then exclude those departments from alerts as well. It's also beneficial for reporting purposes. If you have a subcontractor department, you can easily limit list views and reports if you're looking to report on subcontractors. So those are some of the more common filters we see for managing those timesheet alerts. Cost management is something you'll want to think about. If you have a single cost that your contractor, writes a contract for you to, then it's real simple, right? We can just store that cost at the user record. And then if their cost changes over time, obviously you have the ability to start in those costs and update those costs over time, so that as you're reporting on the past, you get those accurate cost reporting. Often we see customers will have a single contractor they're paying multiple rates based on the type of work they're doing. So in this project, they're acting as a project manager, and as a project manager, we're paying them one rate. And then at this project where he's acting as an architect, and that's a different rate. And we've seen that quite common as well. So OpenAir does have the ability to do project level override. So you could say, my standard cost for John Doe, the contractor, is $50 an hour, but on this project, I'm going to reimburse him $60 an hour. And so OpenAir will override for that project time at the $60 rate. And then for all other projects, they will use the $50 rate. So that's a really neat way to be able to manage that. And I've even actually seen in some cases where they're actually charging different rates on the same project, depending on what task they're putting their time against. And so you can actually extend that cost override all the way to the task if need be, and be able to track different costs on different tasks for different assigned resources. So yet another way to be able to even get a lower level of cost management details. The way the overrides work in OpenAir is when time is entered and approved, it will look at, if you have it enabled at all three levels, it'll first go to the task. If there's a cost override there, it'll use it, and then it will stop. But if it goes to the task and there's no override, then it'll look to the project. If there's an override, it'll use it. If not, it'll go to the user account and use it from there. So it's smart enough to know the hierarchy of how the costs should be entered and managed, and use that hierarchy as it computes the cost of that time entry. And by the way, OpenAir has 3 different cost levels: primary, secondary, and tertiary. You can use these override features for all 3 costs if need be, or any one of the 3. So marking time entries as paid. So this is kind of a little hidden gem of a feature that we often introduce to customers, and I use it quite a bit here at TopStep as well. And it allows you to be able to say, okay, I can go in the system and I can look at all the time that, in this case, Marnie entered as a contractor. And then I get an invoice from Marnie, and I want to be able to say, okay, did Marnie invoice me for all the hours she entered in OpenAir? And so from there, I can go in and select all the time entries that the invoice came through as. And if Marnie omitted, a day or 2 from her invoice to me, then I wouldn't mark those as part of the invoice process. But I would mark everything else. And then what that allows you to do is run reports. You can run accrual reports to say, here's the accrued, we didn't get an invoice from these folks for this month, so we know how many hours they entered, we know the cost that those hours are worth, and so we can then run a report in OpenAir to say, here's the amount of the cost accrual for last month based on the hours entered that we haven't been invoiced for. So that's a pretty neat little way to manage if you're using hours to be able to do that. Let me show you what that looks like in OpenAir. So using the newest UI. So you would come in here and create your filters. So the way to get this feature to work, you basically have to create a couple of custom fields. So there's a reconciled field and a notes field that you need to create. And that basically, it's not a switch that you would need to turn on. It's just a couple of custom fields. And then what you do is once you have that set up, you create the different balance. What do you want to be able to use in the drop down field for the reconciled? So in this case, we have invoiced, open, and paid, but you can have any drop down values here based on what you're using this for. And so I could say, okay, Jody sent me an invoice, and I can go through and see, okay, here's the hours that Jody entered for the period in which that invoice applies to. And I can say she went ahead and invoiced me for everything, but the 9th was not on her timesheet. I'm sorry, on her invoice. So then I could say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and mark everything else as paid. So then I could come in here and using my tips. Oops. Huh. Should be an option in here. I must have picked a bad. There would be an option in here to say mark as paid, and it would go through and it would apply all of these to this. And so then what you would end up with is a reconciled time entry. So here, and if you drill down into the time entry, if you put notes in, you would also see, invoice number 123, so you can track that as well. So sorry for the technical difficulties, but hopefully that showing you the real system helps. So quickly, some of the things that we see customers wanting from a reporting and dashboarding perspective is, if you want your contractor maybe to see what they've been scheduled to and how much time they're expected to work. So you can certainly build reports in OpenAir to show the bookings over week or some period of time, even daily if need be, and be able to share those reports with your team. And then you can limit for the contractors. Obviously, they would only see their own selves in that. And you could also give them similar, to show what time they've entered against which projects for them. So those are kind of some common reports that would be set up for the vendor to be able to see. You may need to use, if you use a report that you share with everyone, be careful and make sure that you test that, and you may need to have a report filter set inside of it to make sure it applies so everyone running it sees exactly what you expect. For you as the hirer of these contractors, you want to make sure that you are monitoring their actuals versus their schedules and their cost forecasting on your projects, making sure their timesheet compliance, just like all of your other employees, making sure you're invoicing reconciliation versus the time that's entered. We have some customers that don't get invoices from their subs. So they actually just pay based on the time entered. And that's another good way to use this time entry feature to be able to say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and reimburse for all of these time entries and mark those as reimbursed. And so as you do this on a regular basis, you're only picking up new time that hasn't been reimbursed yet. And then obviously being able to get your time entry and cost by the different vendor accounts. Some of the things that we see as well around dashboarding for vendors is, planned cost versus actual. And this is generally based on time entry, but it could also be on other factors. Being able to leverage the profile for staffing input and the skill sets. Being able to do your ratio. How much revenue are we generating from our employees versus how much revenue are we generating from our subcontractors? So if you're doing revenue recognition in OpenAir, you could have that sort of balance ratio to see how we're doing, if we need to hire more employees, et cetera. And also looking forward, how busy are our employees versus our subcontractors as part of our forecasting process. Those are some of the key metrics we see customers benefiting from. So in summary, subcontractors are fill a gap, and most of our customers benefit from the use of subcontractors, and as long as you're setting them up, as you're setting their cost management up, and making sure you understand the cost model you want to track, making sure you've got metrics for monitoring your subcontractors, so you keep an eye on the volume and the ratio between your subs and your employees. If you want to use the skill pool, it's really a nice tool to be able to track what subcontractors have what skill set. Since they're not employees, you may not have that intimate knowledge of their abilities, and this would be a great way to be able to track that as part of the OpenAir standard functionality. And then as you're setting up new vendors, whether you're integrated with NetSuite and having that automated process, or you're creating those directly in OpenAir, there's a certain amount of administration you may want to consider, setting up the entity tags, making sure the costs are set up correctly. So, your OpenAir administrator, your super user, or somebody in your operational group, will need to be involved in the process as new vendors are added into your organization.